Hello, everyone. It is my honor to be here as a moderator for the very interesting session named Basic Income, Inequality, and Poverty 3. Above all, I want to express my deepest appreciation to each one of you for participating in this session. I am Gunmin Lee, a research fellow at the Institute for Political and Economic Alternatives. Before we get started, I'd like to make a couple of reminders about how the session will run. First, each presenter will have 15 minutes to complete their presentation. I will notify the presenter if the 15 minutes have elapsed. Second, we'll have approximately 30 minutes for Q&A and general discussion after all three presentations. This session consists of 3 presentations. Let me introduce our first presenter. The first presenter is Benjamin Earle, the General Manager of the Basic Income Canada Network. Please give a presentation.
Thank you. And I am happy to be here, and I hope I can take you briefly through sort of an idea that I've been wrestling with. I know that I'm going to have more information on the slides than I'm going to be able to speak to in 15 minutes, but I'm glad that they'll be able to be shared with everybody in follow-up to the conference. And really what I want to talk about, and I come at this not only as the general manager of Basic Income Canada Network, I do want to acknowledge my perspective. I do also work in food security as the CEO of a food security organization in a community just outside of Toronto. I have extensive work with Basic Income Canada Network, and I also work with other basic income groups in Canada as well. So my perspective is really coming at this as a practitioner, as a service provider, but also as an applied social researcher in the community who's been doing community development and social policy work for many years. I want to really start to talk about food security and the way that basic income can be applied to address the problem of food security, specifically in the Canadian context. Really looking at what do income support programs do to address food insecurity, and what could we benefit from by applying a wider systemic lens to the issue of food insecurity in the Canadian context. But I hope the information from Canada could be useful for other jurisdictions that are thinking about issues like food insecurity. And I also believe that I'm hoping that the thinking here can be applied to broader and other social issues and challenges, and the way that basic income and income security programming in general can intersect with these larger challenges. I'm going to distinguish a little bit in this presentation between conventional ways of thinking about social issues that tend to be linear, cause and problem. We tend to think of the root cause of things like food insecurity as being strictly about income. And that while income is an important component of that, I believe a systems thinking lens helps us understand that food insecurity is not just a challenge of income. It is also a challenge of other systemic issues related to a global food system and a market-based food system. So to begin with, we need to sort of understand the problem in Canada and the problem of food insecurity in Canada. And currently, 18% of Canadians identify as being food insecure, some more severe than others, but overall 18% of the population in Canada identifies as being food insecure. And that equates to about 6.9 million people, including about 1.8 million children who live in food insecure households. So the problem for a country like Canada is quite extensive in the area of food insecurity. This has translated, especially in the last few years, to a precipitous rise in food bank and food charity use. We know that food banks and food charity are not the only response, and nor are they the best response to food insecurity. But as we've seen food insecurity and people becoming more food insecure, we've been seeing a rise in demand and access to these programs in Canada, which has actually put an additional strain on an already strained service in our communities. And has actually brought to bear many of the real issues with food banking and food charity as a response to food insecurity. Food banking is a response to hunger, not a response to food insecurity. And while may be necessary for people, is not going to solve the longer term issue. In the community that I'm in, there was 135,000 visits to food banks in the last year, and that's a community of only 700,000 people. So we are seeing a significant demand for things like food charity at the community level across Canada. And this is happening not just where I am, but across our country. Most definitions of food insecurity in Canada really rely on this idea of it being inadequate or insecure access to food due to financial constraints. And it's linked to households. It's really defined as household food insecurity. And we're really thinking about that as the unit when we're talking about food insecurity. So what if this is the context? The first question I had in sort of in growing and addressing some of my discomfort with how we address this problem is what would actually the impact of a basic income be on the income security of Canadians first and foremost, and then by extension on their food insecurity. So to do that, to assess that understanding, I looked at one of the more defined policy options in Canada through Basic Income Canada Network, created a series of models of basic income a few years ago. I've updated the actual number, the amount of basic income to account for rising cost of living over the last few years. And one of the main model we do talk about in Canada is an income tested model. That is the main model that Canadian advocates are pushing for. But in the BICN work and paper, we did also look at a universal basic income as one of the models. These two charts show the income, the impact on income by decile that a basic income would have if it was applied to the population. So as you can see with the blue columns, for the lower income groups, especially the lower 50%, basic income does, in both types of basic income, do have a fairly significant impact on the incomes of Canadian households. At that, there is an accompanying decline and negative impact on higher income households. That is largely related to the fact that these models have shifts to the income tax code that would allow these models to be paid for. And especially in the universal demogrant model, there's a very significant rise in income on the wealthiest Canadians in order to pay for a universal demogrant, which as the assessed cost would be almost double the total federal budget of Canada. So there would be need to be a significant change to our tax code if these types of basic incomes were applied. I do acknowledge that this is one form of basic income in Canada and it's modeled by one organization. There are obviously other ways to do it that could have different impacts and different adjustments. But this is the overall impact on people's incomes when you assess it. What I then wanted to know is what would that actually mean for people being able to improve their access to food in particular, but also address their cost of living. So what you'll see is a similar chart here, and those lines are the different costs of living. I've used one of them is the MBM, the market basket measure of poverty, which is technically Canada's official measure of poverty. For those of you who don't know, a market basket measure is sort of an aggregate group of goods that are priced out to sort of show what the basic needs would cost, and then an income line is drawn from there. As we see, for most groups, a basic income would get them close to being able to achieve the average MBM for food and housing components of it. But they would not necessarily get the bottom half of the households up to the full MBM. So we still, with these models, would not be getting, with the basic income, would not necessarily getting Canadian households to the point where they could address all of their full needs. And let's remember, this is on top of existing income. So this is not just a basic income alone. This is the impact of the basic income on the whole household. And then we've also included what we use in Canada around the living wage. I know other countries around the world use a living wage. This is an alternative to a minimum wage. And really what it does is geographically looks at what the cost for families would be to live in different geographic regions across the country. It goes as high as $80 an hour in some of our northern Canadian communities where everything is shipped in, to about $20 an hour in some of the more urban communities where things are a little cheaper and able to access. So as we can see from this, a basic income would go pretty close to addressing the issues of the lowest income Canadians. It would certainly give them a better way of life, a better condition of life. They would definitely have better income, but it's not necessarily going to get us up to the point where families are able to meet all of their needs. This has been in the backdrop to this over the last year, especially in Canada, and I know across the world. Food inflation right up until June of 2023 is outpacing inflation overall in Canada by almost 50% higher. It was about 9.1% in June. It's dropped a little bit. Inflation overall in Canada has also dropped down to below 3% since this time. But food inflation and housing, and I've also included the inflation around housing, have outpaced overall inflation. So even when we account for sort of the cost of living dropping overall, we see key items that people need. The cost is continuing to rise at a higher level. So what does this really mean for us is that, by taking this conventional approach that basic income can address food insecurity, because food insecurity is an income security problem, we can reduce household food insecurity in Canada, certainly improve the situation of the lowest income Canadians, but we can't eliminate some of the key challenges of food insecurity. But with a systems approach, we may be able to start thinking about what are some of those other things that we can address, or that we need to think about to create a broader range of food insecurity for more Canadians. Really, when we look at the income side of it, we are really only thinking about the demand side of food insecurity. We're not really thinking about the supply side of food insecurity. And that is a key thing that we need to think about. I'm not going to discern these all in detail in the last time that I have, but I am going to just sort of touch on a few things that sort of indicate why we need to think about this. So Canada is an agricultural country. We were built on agriculture in many ways, and along with other resource development. We are the 19th largest agricultural producing country in the world, and we're a major exporter of agricultural products, especially to the United States, with whom we share, I think, the longest undefended border in the world. So we have a lot of goods going back and forth with the United States every day. But at the same time that we are doing this, at the same time that we are this agricultural powerhouse in many ways, we're experiencing record levels of food insecurity and food bank use. We've got 58% of our food produced ends up as waste or is lost in the system, which is almost 60% of our food that is grown in our country doesn't end up on tables or in producing or other places. And we also have this rise in diet-related diseases are at an all-time high, with 11 million people living with prediabetes or diabetes, and this number continuing to expect to rise. These are all food security issues. Food waste is a food security issue. Record levels of food bank use are a food security issue. And diet-related disease is a food-related issue because it points to the fact that while people may technically have enough to eat, they may not have enough of the right foods to eat. And that is a food security issue. Income can contribute to addressing all of these, but it's not the only part of the problem when you're dealing with a situation like this and you have indicators like this. The other piece that we have in Canada, and I'm bringing this up because it's very topical. I see Chloe smiling. She's my Canadian counterpart. We have a retail monopoly on grocery in Canada, and I know other countries have this as well. But very recently, the Competition Bureau in Canada has held hearings on the grocery monopoly. We've got basically 3 national retail chains, and then 2 international chains, which are Costco and Walmart, that also are a part of our system. 49% of Canadians shop at one grocery retailer, right? That's the Loblaws Corporation, right? So we have a significant monopoly power on grocery retail in Canada, and questions have been brought up about how this relates to prices that people pay. And in fact, there have been issues found with prices, especially of things like bread. There's been illegal price fixing been found with bread in Canada. So we know Canadians are being affected by the fact that we have monopoly power in our food system. Again, income can help address this, but it's not the only solution when prices can continually rise as incomes sort of stay stagnant. So in Canada, the key challenge here that I want to end with really is that agriculture has been positioned almost entirely in economic terms for a long time. And that's one of the key challenges here. Even talking about basic income as a response to food insecurity and rising incomes as a response to getting people access to food is an economic solution, right? It's not talking about the larger food system issues and really what our right to food might be. We're thinking about how do we get people access to food through a retail system that clearly has some challenges. The question I really have is access to what? What are we getting people access to when we increase their incomes? This may provide solutions to basic income, may provide solutions to the problem of food insecurity, and they are well-intentioned, they are based in justice, and they do improve people's lives, but they may not actually be doing much to actually address the larger systemic issues that are creating the disparity in food access in the first place. So where does this leave us? our market-based food system with a focus on profitability does commodify food and the food that it produces and processes. A conventional approach will address this problem in many ways and get people better access to food, but it will not completely eliminate it. While a basic income will improve food security for many Canadians, the achievement of true food security will only come with a systemic approach where we think about the larger things going on in a global market-based food system. And this is sort of, I'm not going to go too much on this. This is the layers of sort of thinking. If we think about food insecurity as being a food problem, we will focus on responses that give people food banks, right? And food charities. If we think about it as being inadequate or insecure in access to money for food, we will focus on income-based solutions, basic income security programs. And if we think about those combined with the larger systemic issue, we will address those pieces while also thinking about the larger systemic issues that create community-wide food insecurity and actually make our food system vulnerable to many of the current challenges we face. Climate change, global instability have all contributed to price rising in food across the globe. So to conclude, the Food Secure Canada submitted some proposals as part of the development of Canada's National Food Strategy policy. This was started in 2018 and sort of went into 2019. There are 5 recommendations here, and I'm not going to go into them each of detail, but as you can see, basic income can play a part in each of these pieces. None of what I should be talking about should take away from the fact that I am a basic income advocate who does believe that basic income is the right next step for us as a society to improve the lives of Canadians and people globally around the world. But we need to think about it in the context of other issues, and we need to think about the role that it can play while we think about broader systemic issues that create the challenges that we face. We can use basic income, for example, to support a sustainable food system by using it as a way to support small-scale farmers as they build agricultural businesses in our communities. Think about it as an entrepreneurial tool, giving people the foundation they need to create new businesses in that sector that they may not have otherwise. Think about it in Canada, reconciliation with First Nations and our Indigenous population is a very important and rightfully so prominent issue now. Chloe and I could probably both talk for a long time about why, as we both learn as settlers in our country about how we can do better for our Indigenous peoples. But a basic income, while there's some complexities with how it might roll out in many of our Indigenous communities, it can be a piece to support our First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people to access food, especially those who live in remote communities. Many of our First Nations live in remote communities, whether it's in Northern Ontario. And for context, and I showed this for context, Ontario is about 3 times the size of Korea, just as a province. So our northern communities are very remote in just that province. That does not include the northern territories of Canada, which are butt up against the Arctic Circle, where they can't grow much food and where the cost of food is very high because of their inability to grow there. So we need to be thinking about ways that a basic income could support those communities in accessing the food in their different contexts. But also we need to be thinking about other ways to ensure our First Nations and Indigenous communities are food secure in ways that are culturally appropriate for them. And then the last piece here, and we've talked a little bit about this in some other sessions, and we can't, and I think Chloe said this eloquently in her last session, we can't expect a basic income to encourage people or allow people to become advocates, but it certainly can give them the space to become advocates, right? We can't expect it of them, but we can, if they had an income, more people could speak up about their food needs, more people could become involved in community-based food programming, more people could become involved in movements such as the Food as Commons movement, which I'm increasingly part of, such as the food sovereignty movement in many communities. So basic income has a role, but it is not the only solution to food insecurity. Thank you, and I will end there.
Thank you very much for the wonderful presentation, Benjamin. The second presentation is by Dr. Vibhor Mathur from the University of Bath. He will give a presentation via Zoom. Dr. Vibhor Mathur, please give a presentation.
Good morning. Am I audible?
대구 시민들은 30년째 대구시가 3, 4선 꼴찌 도시다라는 것을
Can I confirm that everyone can hear me? Awesome. Great, thank you. I'll share my screen in a second. Excellent. Good morning. Wonderful to be here in the room virtually with everyone. Unfortunately, I couldn't make it to Korea this time. But my name is Vibhor. I'm at the University of Bath, and I'm part of a wider project called Work Free, which is a universal basic income pilot that we're running in the south of India with about 400 families across 5 urban slum communities. And primarily the question that I am interested in exploring is what can a UBI plus, as we call it, and I'll explain what the UBI plus is, what can that do in the fight for more freedom, dignity, and decent work? Very quickly, what is the decent work agenda? The decent work agenda, as outlined in the 8th UN Sustainable Development Goal, and further in the constitutions of the ILO and the UN, amongst other things, focuses on the importance of values like freedom, dignity, voice, and social protection in labor and in work for all people. However, the reality of most policy solutions that are currently aiming to achieve decent work globally can be summarized loosely into a few different categories. The first is what scholars have been calling neo-abolition. We see this very commonly with sex work, with child labor, where if you see some sort of activity that is deemed indecent, you intervene, you stop that work, you rescue the people involved in that work, and you put them in a more secure facility. Enough and more research is now finding that actually what this ends up doing is making people's lives materially worse than they were earlier. And it doesn't really explore the conditions that push them into such work in the first place. The second category is what I'm loosely calling recognition politics. The picture here is India has a practice of manual scavenging, which is human beings go into sewers to clean human waste. And in the picture you see here, the Indian Prime Minister in this much publicized event washed the feet of manual scavengers. And I remember looking at the newspaper and saying, just give them machines. It does little to materially improve their lives once again. And it doesn't actually address the sources of indignity, the sources of unfreedom in their lives. The third is another very common sort of stream of policymaking is in-kind programming. So, if a group of women were involved in sex work, stop them from doing sex work, give them all sewing machines, make them all tailors, train them all to work in salons, without actually asking these women, what do you want to do with your lives? How can your lives be made better as per your understanding? And the fourth, and this is the category that sort of the people that I work with most closely fall into, is when their labor straight away basically gets invisibilized or market regulated. And the examples of people that I work with, which are garbage collectors or domestic workers, that is people who work in other people's houses doing housekeeping, cooking, cleaning, etc. Their job effectively gets regulated purely by the market and therefore invisibilized, and the government almost feels like, oh, this problem has now been dealt with. And effectively, research with people involved in such work, including those who are beneficiaries of such policy responses, has found that their lives do not actually materially improve, nor does their psychosocial experience of freedom or dignity. And therefore, the question that is asked is, what happens if we just give people money? And that's effectively what our program is trying to test. The basic assumption is that people who enter any sort of indecent work do so willingly, but in the absence of meaningful alternatives. That is, material and structural conditions, whether that is things like poverty, race, caste, gender, effectively force people into certain types of jobs. And the question that we had was, what can a UBI do? What can the economic floor that a basic income gives to people do in their capacity to say no, or their power to say no, as Carl Widerquist puts it? Very quickly, as context, garbage collectors and domestic workers, who are primarily the residents of the urban slums where our pilot runs, the people who I work with, their work is characterized by very low incomes, very poor working conditions. They're self-employed, and as a result, do not have even the basic protections that come with any sort of employment. Their labor organization is characterized by weak unionization, weak social contract. And along with this, they are constantly at risk of extreme musculoskeletal and respiratory diseases. And to add to all of this precarity is the fact that such work is caste typified and it is conducted at the intersection of the compounding stigmas of disease, of material hygiene, of caste, and of social hygiene. So their work is considered both physically dirty as well as socially dirty. And in this context, the work-free program effectively involves giving all residents of these 5 urban slum communities 18 months of unconditional universal cash. Along with this, the plus that I was saying in the UBI plus is along with the cash, we also give 24 months of local participatory needs-based community organizing support. And I am part of a wonderful team which is conducting a mixed method study to evaluate effectively what happens as a result of this intervention. Very quick note, the last session of tomorrow is when we're doing a roundtable on work-free and what we found at the midline of our project. Anybody interested, we'd love to see you there as well. So primarily, I'm asking 2 questions. I'm arguing that the policy responses that I was highlighting earlier fail and are poorly constructed because we don't have a grounded understanding of what freedom and dignity means to the people whose lives we are trying to provide freedom and dignity to. These are abstract, esoteric concepts that are defined either in the rooms of theorists or in the rooms of policymakers, without a grounded understanding of what does it mean to the people themselves. And 2, I'm trying to study the effects of this UBI plus intervention on decent or indecent work. Over the last 2 years, I've had the privilege of conducting very, very embedded and engaged qualitative research in the form of semi-structured interviews, focus group discussions, lots of ethnographic observations, as well as some creative and participatory tools, including with young children. Over the next few slides, I'm going to primarily present to you sort of what I have found and what I think is the answer of how UBI contributes to this fight. But very quickly, what is dignity and how can dignity be understood? First and foremost, both from literature as well as from my research in the field, we find that when we speak of dignity in 2 senses always. The first, we speak of dignity in this inherent basic level of basic value that all human beings should have. So when we say slavery is against human dignity, we're talking about this base level of inherent value that all human beings should have, and nobody should be allowed to fall below that. And the other is this sort of earned or this sort of attributed dignity, which is what we speak of when we speak of being dignified. And effectively, in my framework, and I'm not going to spend too long on this, but my framework identifies dignity or the experience of dignity as a combination of these 3 things. The first is recognition of my humanity, recognition of my identity, recognition of my contribution to the world that I inhabit. Relationality, that is both the ability to create and as a result of recognition, I'm trying to avoid things like invisibilization. The second is relationality, which is my ability to create and live up to my relationships. And as a result, the freedom from humiliation, from subjugation, from dehumanization. And third, autonomy, the ability to control the life project that I live, the ability to be able to live my life the way I want without being dependent on anyone. Importantly, of course, this is not a form of autonomy that says I want to get rid of everyone around me, but a form of relational autonomy that says I would ideally like to I would like to be able to renegotiate the terms on which I live with the people that I'm with. And this sort of dignity comes really clearly when people are talking about what is it that they aspire to their lives. So when we speak to garbage collectors, for instance, even though their work has all of the precarity and stigma that I spoke about earlier, most of them don't tell me that this is work that they want to leave immediately, that this is terrible work. If anything, this is work that is much better than other alternatives available to them. What they are striving for, however, is greater control over the way they do their day. What they're striving for is greater recognition. So one of the most common answers I got was garbage collectors saying, people call us Chatta Ammai, which literally translates from Telugu to garbage woman. And they say, why can they not call me auntie? Why can they not call me by my name? Why must I be associated with garbage? And therefore, understanding the realities of how recognition, relationships, and autonomy is experienced is really, really important in the process of creating more grounded policies for decent work. But what happens with the UBI? What happens with the UBI plus? Primarily, I argue, and I won't go into too much detail here today, but primarily we find 3 main uses for how people are using their cash. The first and most important one is people being able to divert this money towards household expenses. The lives of those in urban poverty is characterized by living in deprivation. And most people told us how the UBI gives them just that little extra elbow room, that little extra space to be able to not constantly be preoccupied by where the next meal is coming from, not constantly having to say no to their children when they're asking them for a treat, even if that's something as small as a packet of crisps. We also saw an increase in consumption of high protein food items. We've seen that people's consumptions of eggs, meat, chicken, and fish goes up, which obviously has huge nutritional benefits, but it also has huge social and psychological benefits because these are also the foods that people consider to be treat items, people consider to be happy food, people consider food that they enjoy eating. The second big use, and this is perhaps from a financial and monetary perspective the most significant, has been the massive impacts that the UBI has had on people's savings, credit, and insurance. Some of the numbers you can see on the slide. Almost 1 in 4 households, 25% almost, could pay off entirely their existing debt. Many of them were able to buy more private health insurance, send their children to private schools, both of which are perceived to be better than the state-provided services in health and education. Over 40% of the households could start a new savings pot. And for many of them, they said that this is the first time in their lives that they had any significant savings. And this is really important, particularly from a labor perspective, is that people were able to invest a lot of their money as seed capital for the work that they do. Like I said, most of them are entrepreneurs, whether they are garbage collectors or whether they're a tea shop owner or whether they're a tailor. People were able to reduce their reliance on credit and divert a lot of their money into more generative and productive assets. A very quick story. There's a lady who told us that for many years, she's a tailor, and she'd been telling her husband that she wants to get a scooter so that she can go around to the nearby communities as well and get more tailoring jobs. And her husband kept saying, no, we don't have the money, we can't really afford it. But when the cash started coming in, she said, okay, let's pool in our money as a house and use this to pay the installments for the scooter. So they took a loan, and actually when they took the loan, they didn't need to touch the UBI money. They managed to find money within their budget. But the cash gave them that capacity to aspire. The cash gave them that courage to take that leap, to be able to invest in their work. Similarly, a lot of these people sell what is called muggu. It is a granite powder that is used very commonly in South India to make decorative patterns outside people's houses. And the cycle of buying and selling muggu is that people take petty credit on a daily basis and repay that on a daily basis from local money lenders to be able to just run the cash flow of managing this business. But with the cash, people who used to borrow 4 times a month went down to borrowing once a month. And they said to us, you give us 2,000 rupees, but it ends up becoming 8,000 rupees because of the amount of money that we save on interest. And there's obviously a lot of other things that, like I said, we're going to talk about what happens with the UBI on the people tomorrow. But primarily, the question that I'm interested in is what can we learn then about people's labor choices, about decent work, and about exit? One really fascinating study is, and I know this is such a hot topic in UBI conversations, of what happens, will people stop working if you give them cash? And I know most pilots found that actually there's very little impact on people's labor. We say very, very proudly that our pilot has shown that people actually reduce the amount they work. But that's a wonderful thing, because most people in our communities, most participants, are working 7 days a week starting 4 a.m. And we found that at least 12% of them reduced from 7 days a week to 6 days a week. Many of them, an old man who I was interviewing, about 68 years old, he said, every morning I wake up and my body is often killing me with pain. He has some form of arthritis. But I know that if I don't go for work, I'm not going to eat. But with the cash, I can say that, okay, if I don't go today, I'll still have food on my table. I can today use this money to pay my neighbor to go and do my rounds of garbage collection, and I will still be okay. Having said that, the more important change, and all the examples that I've given you around entrepreneurship, around this old person, highlights that rather than exiting work, the form of exit that a basic income allows for is greater rejigging and renegotiation for the way in which I organize my work. It gives me greater control, greater autonomy, and greater sense of ability to negotiate how I construct my life project and how I construct work around me when cash is provided to me as this social buffer, as a form of security. But there's a more important and a wider finding, and I'm wrapping up with this, is that all the things that I've shown you, household expenses, credit, health insurance, etc., highlight that of all the insecurities, sorry, I don't know why this is here twice, but of all the insecurities and indignities in one's life, labor is only one of the problems. And cash as a universal medium of exchange has the capacity to accommodate for the diversity of insecurities and indignities that people have. And the core difference, therefore, between UBI and other forms of policy that I highlighted earlier is that they are not trying to provide people dignity, but it's giving people the means with which they can earn the dignity, they can construct the life project that they want. And I'm sorry if I've gone over time. With that, I'm wrapping up. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much for the wonderful presentation, Vibhor. And the third presentation is by Vanir scholar Chloe Halpenny from Queen's University. Please give a presentation.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay. Hello. Okay. I think this is the microphone. Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Chloe. I'm a first-year PhD student at Queen's University, which is in Kingston, Canada. I also come as one of the co-chairs and co-founders of the Basic Income Canada Youth Network, so wear a couple hats coming to this work. I am not joined today by my much more knowledgeable in this area co-author, Dr. Elaine Power, who has done a lot of work in the realm of food and income security. She's also my PhD supervisor, and we've been working together on this over the past couple of months and are excited to share some findings with you today. So thank you to the other presenters. I'm glad I'm going third because I feel like I can touch on a couple of things that both of you shared in your presentations, but you also set the bar high, so not as glad about that. Although I do think Ben in particular offered some really important context for Canada that I don't have to cover anymore when it comes to food. Today, we'll be presenting a paper titled A Seat at the Dinner Table, Food, Eating, and the Ontario Basic Income Pilot, really looking at qualitative research on the Ontario pilot and how it shaped, how receipt of a basic income through participation in that pilot shaped people's experiences with food and eating in a diversity of ways. So, let's see. There we go. So we'll start out with some of the sort of just approach pieces and then move on to findings where we'll be looking at how people's relationships with food changed through 5 different lenses, which we'll get to these shortly, and then ending with discussion and implications. But first, just to start out, for those who don't know, the Ontario Basic Income Pilot was a relatively short-lived policy experiment that ran in Ontario, Canada from 2018 to 2019. It was launched by the former provincial Liberal government as a poverty reduction experiment and provided over 4,000 Ontario residents with a guaranteed annual income of anywhere from $17,000 to $24,000 for singles and couples, with an additional top up for people with disabilities. And while the relationship between poverty and food insecurity is well documented, as Ben also touched on, a more nuanced understanding of the implications of a basic income for food access and quality and reliability, especially through a qualitative lens, is more lacking. So what we've done here is both Elaine and I had done work on the Ontario pilot through qualitative interviews, me through my master's research and her through another project with some other academics. And we pooled our interviews together, which was almost 80 in total, to look at the following broad question, which was, how did the receipt of a basic income affect Ontario pilot participants' day-to-day relationships with food and eating, particularly compared to their previous contexts? And we've organized our findings across 5 different themes, looking at 5 different lenses or frames through which people's relationships with food shifted. And we'll begin by looking at food as survival. And you'll see it quoted here where I've used them, but there's images from the Humans of Basic Income project, which was a pilot participant named Jessie Golem, who's also a very talented photographer, took a portrait series of pilot participants, many of which capture some of the themes quite well here. So starting with survival. So before receiving a basic income, a common theme emerged for many people, which was that they simply couldn't afford to put enough food on the table. This struggle was arguably especially profound for people who were previously receiving provincial social assistance or welfare, which is very low, very inadequate, very insufficient, and this is pretty well known in Canada. And with basic income, many saw immediate improvements in their food security, just in terms of the sufficiency or having enough food to eat and really addressing hunger. That extra purchasing power meant that they could afford enough food. And for many, this was for the first time. So, quote, we were eating fuller meals at dinner time. No one was going hungry at any point. We had constant snacks in the cupboard. So this was about avoiding hunger, but also was about arguably so much more. Many were able to abandon food-related survival strategies that were often dehumanizing or not particularly effective to begin with, such as food banks. Others saw their stress and anxiety related to procuring enough food dramatically decline, and saw a renewed sense of dignity, again, just from having enough food to eat. So a quote on the bottom left about food bank use. I don't like using the food bank. I didn't use it when I was on basic income. I didn't need it. It makes me upset that I have to go. I don't like to beg, and that's what I'm doing. In this supposedly great country of ours, nobody should have to beg for food. People should have money to go out and buy groceries. Nobody should have to use a food bank. And then just speaking to that reduced stress and sense of dignity, that quote to the bottom right saying it helps with your emotional, your mental well-being, because you're not stressing that if you spend a little extra on food that you're going to be broke. So those were some very apparent and immediate changes that basic income had in people's lives when it came to food. And while this was largely a matter of meeting basic needs, simply having enough to eat offered a really essential foundation for other forms of, arguably higher order change in people's lives. So I won't read the whole quote here, but this is someone saying, I don't think that my wife would have went back to school at all if we didn't get that money. This person went back to finish post-secondary education while they were on the pilot. She never would have felt it was okay to do that if we didn't have our basic needs taken care of. Having a roof over our heads and being able to have a full fridge, that changes the game in terms of perception and what your choices can be. So the second theme that emerged in the interview data was related to food as nutrition, or people's access to not just enough food, but food that is healthy, food that is nutritious. While Canada's Food Guide tells us, a little bit condescendingly, if you ask me, that making healthy choices doesn't have to cost more, it does. That actually is not really a statistical fact. It's estimated that the average monthly cost of nutritious food for a single person in Canada's capital, where I live, is $392, which is almost half of the monthly income of somebody who's receiving Ontario Works, which is welfare in Ontario. So quite significant. The reality is that purchasing fresh, nutritious food in Canada is more expensive and often is not a viable option for people who are living on low incomes. And prior to basic income, many participants described having been surviving on boxed or canned food, or whatever they could afford, which they were very keenly aware were not quote unquote healthy options. So in this regard, access to a basic income gave many more autonomy and choice at the grocery store, which directly translated in so many cases to more fresh, nutritious food for participants and their families. So as one person put it, I didn't have to have my calculator open to see if I could make it to the dairy fridge at the end of the store before I ran out of money. If I wanted a cauliflower, I could have a cauliflower. You can't do that on ODSP, which is sort of Ontario Works Complement. It's the welfare program for disabled low-income people in Ontario. On ODSP, you eat bread, pasta, rice, all the cheap and cheerful carbs that you can, because you've got to get filled up and you've got to do it as cheaply as possible. It changed the way I interact with the world. The shift in access to nutritious food, many perceived a direct impact on their personal health and well-being, and found that improvements in their diet translated directly to better health outcomes. And this was for people in general, and also people with disabilities or chronic illnesses, especially those who had very specific dietary restrictions. But this person saying, quote, the better foods I had, the more energy I had, the better health I had. My illness didn't affect me so much. I was swimming an hour and a half, 3 times a week when I was on basic income because I was eating healthy. I had the fuel for my body to do it. And this person spoke very, very lovingly about her experience with having an access to her local swimming pool on basic income. And that was something she really loved to do, and made her feel a lot better when she had the chance to do it. But it wasn't something she could do otherwise. So in a neoliberal context where health is both highly individualized and used as a marker for good or responsible citizenship, access to, quote, healthy eating practices becomes a strategy for survival and belonging for those in poverty. So pilot participants' newfound ability to buy nutritious food carries both practical and symbolic significance. So people were happy that they could access more nutritious food, but also the ability to eat healthily was about navigating a society that often places unfair burdens on those with limited resources. It's a reminder that health isn't just about individual choices, but is rather deeply intertwined with social and economic factors, especially income, which people were also keen to challenge. So I'll read the bottom quote. It makes no sense. One of the things doctors tell you is to eat right, rest, no stress, and exercise. And all of this is related to income in some way, shape, or form. It's almost as if you're non-compliant if you're living in poverty. So people were both grateful to be able to be compliant and access the benefits that afforded, but also very consciously aware of the fact that that was the reality in which they were living. The third that I'll touch on, which is maybe my personal favorite, is food as connection. So beyond having access to more or more nutritious food, so many people discussed food in the context of personal relationships and connections, recognizing that so much of our social fabric and the way that we cultivate relationships with other people connects back to food. So the additional security and stability afforded by basic income offered many people improved access to the social relations of food and eating. So this looked a couple different ways. So for many people, they didn't have the constant stress of food insecurity or hunger, and found that they had more emotional space to cultivate relationships without that worry being top of mind. So that quote in orange, it made our family closer because I felt more able to talk with them. I was always afraid of talking with them that I'd be saying, no, I'm out of food, I'm out of money. I didn't want to complain about anything. When I was on basic income, we just had conversations, and food and transportation never came up. And then the second, it made us happier when my kids would come with the grandkids. I could put a meal on the table and sit down and have a family meal on a Sunday with my children and my grandchildren and have a little treat in the house for them. Just that alone brought pleasure. So again, that reduction in stress, but also access to food as a measure of care, gratitude, and appreciation, without the stress of actually being able to afford enough to eat day to day. Several participants also described the profound impact basic income had on the ability to enjoy shared meals. So for many people, basic income opened up the door to partake in social activities that relied on having the disposable income to be able to do so. So this either meant like going to restaurants or coffee with friends, or being able to do any socializing without having to sacrifice dinner that evening, for instance. So again, this carried symbolic significance beyond just the ability to do that. It meant that people perceived stronger and more reciprocal relationships with their loved ones, that they felt less isolated and were able to spend more time in community, and overall perceived a greater sense of belonging and support. So there were a lot of quotes like this, but I'll read 2 of them. I think we were able to be a little more social because maybe we did have $20 to go down to the farmer's market and be among people and part of the community. When you're on ODSP, you don't have the extra money to do that kind of stuff. And the second, I was able to have more contact with friends because when people would be going out for dinner or out for lunch or something, then I could come. I didn't have to worry about if I have to borrow money or they have to pay for me or what happens when the bill comes. The fourth is food as responsibility, which really spoke to how basic income influenced people's ability to fulfill various social roles and obligations related to food. And this took a number of forms, but was connected to how people were able to provide for themselves or provide for their family, and being able to be that provider of nourishment and provider of food in a way that they didn't necessarily previously have access to. For some people, it meant being able to shop consciously or ethically and feel good about the food purchasing decisions that they were making. So for instance, one person saying, I could go and spend a week with my daughter and be a contributing member, bringing my own food and not taking from her. For a long time, when the kids came to visit me, they'd have to bring the snacks because I don't have them. As a Nana, that really bites because we're supposed to. And then the second person saying, basic income made me feel like I was contributing to society and having the extra money, spending it locally, helping the farmers market, helping the local stores. Before, I always had to go to Food Basics, which is a chain grocery store in Canada. That's the only place I could afford anything. So people, again, felt like their money represented, the money that they were spending on food represented more in many cases. And in a society that values many of these things, whether that be self-sufficiency or providing for family or making these quote unquote ethical decisions, this offered a sense of inclusion and dignity that was really, really important for people. And the final one I'll touch on is food as pleasure, which is where we shift our focus to the ability to quote unquote indulge in what some might consider luxury food items or treats. I use the word luxury cautiously and kind of ickily, but it's a shift towards food as something to be enjoyed, and not just a question of sustenance. And this really contributed to people's sense of dignity and well-being once again. So this is mostly quotes because I think the quotes kind of speak for themselves, but it meant basic income meant for many people that they could experience food and eating as an act of joy, or with a sense of curiosity without stress, anxiety, or guilt. People who previously were having to be very careful at the grocery store and very, very intentional about what ingredients they were buying, could try new things. This quote in orange saying, my daughter tried dragon fruit, she tried papaya, she tried honey melon, and she's obsessed with dragon fruit now. People being able to sort of splurge on things just because they enjoyed them, which is one of the things that we like the most about food, is that it tastes good. And that is something that arguably everyone should have access to. So I could say, you know what, let's go walk down the street and get ice cream. It was nice to be able to do that instead of saying, sorry, guys, we had to buy food and we had to pay bills. We can't. So food as pleasure is the last one. So just wrapping up in terms of discussion and implications, what can we take away from these findings? In the context of basic income, I think part of what this offers is a shift to thinking of food as nourishment. So physical, but also mental, spiritual, emotional, and social fulfillment, all of which are mediated by access to income. I think sort of some complementarity with Ben's presentation, where Ben is asking, what if a basic income isn't enough to address food insecurity? I think Elaine would be comfortable with me saying, yes, correct, good question, important question. And also I think the additional piece here for me is, what if food security or food insecurity isn't the only question we might be looking at when we're thinking about food and basic income? Looking at interview data from pilot participants really opens up space to think about food through a diversity of lenses, and I think also maybe challenges us to push our thinking on what constitutes good outcomes in terms of food. The qualitative data also suggests that food insecurity, I think that conventional thinking, but that isn't always conventional for some people. It was not that people didn't know what healthy food was or didn't know how to make healthy food, or just needed some financial literacy courses. It was a question of income for so many people. And also we saw, because of when these interviews took place, which was following people's receipt of a basic income, we saw that space for change where people were really able to speak to a before and after basic income and speak to the change that occurred as a function of receiving basic income, with many noting that a lot of these changes that were noted reversed immediately upon the pilot's cancellation. So whereas where people could afford healthy food when the pilot was canceled, they no longer could. So with that, I will wrap up and happy to answer questions or speak after. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the interesting presentation, Chloe. We'll now have time for Q&A and a general discussion of the three presentations. Please raise your hand if you have any questions or would like to say something about the presentations. Please press the button.
Is this working? I had a question for Vibhor. On the beginning of your presentation, maybe this is a bit off, but this is to break the ice. But you began by presenting three positions towards the workers you were dealing with. And the first one was neo-abolitionism. And I wondered how, I can see, and having spoken with Neil before, I see how he had this criticism of this movement that calls itself neo-abolitionist, and how this thing of forbidding work is problematic. But at the same time, I wondered how much the rejection of the abolitionist ambition was not a bit regrettable, and could you not describe in a way the struggle for basic income, in the struggle for the abolition of poverty instead of the abolition of a certain form of labor, or the forbidding of labor? So that's the first question.
Do I answer this now, or do we do a couple?
Now, yeah, please answer to the question.
Thank you for that. And I think in principle, I agree almost entirely with what you're saying. And I think the core shift is exactly there, where what is it that we're trying to attack? Are we trying to attack this form of labor, or are we trying to attack the poverty in this case, or any sort of the structural markers that force or create such labor at all? So if you are trying to say that we want to shift the focus away from the abolition, to keep the spirit of abolition, but move it away from labor to more structural factors, then yeah, I'm all for that. And I think that potentially basic income can be a tool, hopefully, in that pursuit effectively. Have I understood your question?
Yes, I actually had another small question. Can I carry on? So there was, I had noted another question about, you used the notion of UBI plus, and but you used it in a way to describe. I mean, it felt to me that what you described as the plus in your UBI plus was something like what Siwa did in some of the villages in the guy standing experiment, and it didn't call plus. Whereas it seemed to me that when I had heard talked about basic income plus, it was used maybe by Simon Duffy, as in the plus was maybe something more substantial than organizing, as in extra money or basic income in kind over the basic income. So I wondered if you could comment on this choice of the use of the UBI plus. Are you in touch with Simon Duffy? Or?
Absolutely, and thank you for flagging that, because I didn't have time actually to talk more about what our sort of plus is. Obviously, the idea of a plus is literally anything along with the UBI. The argument being that cash is a vehicle, it's a catalyst, but it's not a panacea where in and of itself it will solve all the world's problems. And I think around the world there are different pluses. Like I know in the US there was a lot of talk about the plus being things like financial literacy or those sorts of interventions. And I know that Simon's work talking about other sort of add-ons effectively to the UBI. So I'm aware of his use of the plus. In the Welsh pilot currently, for instance, the government's idea of the plus is continuing with the sort of social support services that care leavers get along with the cash. So they all have different uses of the plus. And you're right, Seva in the Guy Standing and Sheriff experiment from 2011-12 also had a form of plus. They called it voice. and it was a form of unionizing and getting people together. Ours is just yet another addition to that experimentation of what All Plus can be. R Plus, and we'll be talking a lot more about this tomorrow, is a form of very relational, needs-based, participatory community organizing. So it's saying cash can help create time and space, and then a facilitated space and the tools to come together and organize can sort of aid that process of meeting needs and solving problems. So ours is one other form of experimentation, along with lots of the other very fantastic ones. I think I have a slight objection to the way Plus is used in the US. So I'm sort of away from the whole give them financial literacy along with UBI school. But I think the idea of R Plus is to say, here are the tools. How can you create whatever structures you need to meet your needs better using the cash? And that's the form we use in Plus. And yeah, thank you for flagging that.
Another question? Please.
First, I will start with a little comment. It never ceases to amaze me how many people seem surprised that if you give poor people money, their lives are improved. And we somehow keep needing studies to actually prove it to policymakers that, you know, this is actually what happens. Wow. And I wanted a clarification from Canada on whether if basic income would become a policy, if receiving it would exclude you from receiving other forms of benefit, because that's a big discussion in Germany, for example, and the way to introduce it is complicated because of that argument. So I want to know how it is there.
The answer is no. Short answer is no. There are models that three models of policy options. All right. There's three models within BICN's policy options. One of them limits the basic income to those who are 18 to 64 because it then interacts with existing seniors benefits. So there would be top ups. So you'd be technically, yes, you would be excluded from the basic income program, but it would be integrated with we have current existing programs. That's one model. I'm not an advocate of that. I actually believe in a model that would cover all adults so that it makes it a lot more seamless. We've had this question a lot. We've actually had this question, I don't know if you've experienced this, from conspiracy people who think that if you lose out on a basic income if you aren't vaccinated, or like that's where the discussion has been, which is kind of crazy in Canada. But no, you would still have access. We have universal health care. You'd have access. It wouldn't change your access to any existing program. What it might do, and some of the models, it could merge with programs. So for example, if there was a federal basic income, there could be a way that it's done that eliminates the current provincial welfare programs, right? But it would eliminate them and replace it. It wouldn't eliminate your access to it. You still may have access to provincial programs that meet specific needs. In fact, I'm actually a believer that that's actually a better way for our provinces to address, right? We could have more targeted programs for the specific needs of people, whether it was people with disabilities or mental health issues or opioid crisis. Maybe we could invest differently in that if a basic income was administered federally. If income security was taken care of federally, we could have better programs locally. So it wouldn't eliminate your access to the programs, but it could and it should lead to a complete change to how we do a lot of these programming. So that's the short answer is no, but the long answer is it could be a complex reimagining of how we do these programs. So yes, it could eliminate access to certain programs, but the goal would be to do that in a way that provides a better income security support, right? Does that make sense? Yeah. So no one in Canada is advocating to eliminate any other program, at least the serious advocates are not. So yeah.
Just to clarify further, in Germany, the benefits work in different brackets. So basically, if you would be receiving, I don't know, a disability or even better, an unemployment benefit, receiving basic income on top of that would elevate you to a different bracket. So it would exclude you from the other one, and you would end up with less money. So it needs a careful approach.
Some of the models actually call it basic income in Canada, Yeah. So yeah, so the same thing could happen in Canada, but that's a tax system question and part of the design questions. Did you, sorry.
No, I don't know how to work this either. Now it's on?
I think it's on, yeah.
Yeah, I don't have a lot to add to that other than to say, adequacy is like a huge feature within Canadian basic income advocacy. So I think that thinking around how it interacts with provincial social assistance programs in particular, like any model of basic income that's been seriously proposed by advocates has been like far and away at higher levels than provincial social assistance programs. Those programs, which like often when I'm talking about ODSP in Ontario works, like I'm distilling it down to income, but those are pathways to a lot of other in-kind supports, for instance, employment and training supports. And a lot of people who are working in those programs right now, their time is taken up by deciding whether or not people are eligible and whether or not they should get a bus ticket to go to a job interview. Like it's like really tied up in things like that. And in conversations that we've had, like at the different levels, because the jurisdictional questions are also very complicated in Canada. Like I think provinces are keen to be able to reshape their provincial systems to be able to better attend to some of those in-kind supports and then have the income pieces be shifted upwards. Like, so the idea is that nobody is worse off. That said, there are programs in Canada that are really awful for a lot of different reasons that people would probably no longer be eligible for. And for the most part, that would probably be a good thing because they're bad. Yeah.
Do you have any questions? Then I have a question to Benjamin. I think the concept of food as commons is very interesting. Could you tell us more detail why we think food as commons?
This is a new area that I'm exploring, and it really does build on my understanding of Guy Standing's work around the commons in general. And there is in Canada, there is actually a growing literature around this, especially coming out of Indigenous communities, around how we use food as a community tool and how we really what we've done is we've commodified our access to food when historically, and I'm an anthropologist by training, historically food was a community property, just like any other commons. We've commodified it to the point where we now need to be talking about ways to access it through income. The food as commons would sort of, like other commons and commoning arguments, would look at food as a common property. Obviously, that's very complicated, especially when you're dealing with a global, economically market-driven food system. But there are really interesting conversations starting to happen, or in Canada specifically, around what that might mean. They're also happening in other parts of the world. I know we have colleagues from India. There's lots of discussion around this, and it's coming from places like India and other places around the world around how food is a community thing and it belongs to us all. How do we start thinking about it growing together? It's in a very micro sense. We see this in the movement for urban farming and community gardens in places where I live in Canada, where people can garden together and grow small amounts of food to supplement their diets. Obviously in Canada, it's very seasonal. We have a very long winter where you can't grow anything, but we have a very strong agricultural season as well, where you can grow a lot. So there is that's sort of a microcosm of it. So it's really all the food as commons is taking the discussion we have around other types of commons that we've talked about, I think, at this conference, and I think is going to be talked about more, land, other pieces. And it really just focuses in on food and looks at it as a piece of our common history and our common society, and reimagines it away from being a commodity.
Thank you very much. Do you have any questions or comments? Please.
Yeah. So it's a bit hard to. So both of you are based in Canada and working here on this notion of food security and basic income. And it's a bit so. I'd heard coming from human rights literature. I'd heard that there was a book which I could never find again, but it made some noise at some point, of a guy criticizing the language of human rights for the rights to food. And then when in 2014 there was the Congress, the Bien Congress in McGill, there were some sort of reminiscence of this, and I wondered how the. I'm sorry, this is not a well-structured question, but like in France at the moment, we have like a project that they call themselves social security of alimentation of food, food social security, something like this. And they try to tie this the form of basically we say income guarantee in kind, or kind of integrate the whole sector to guarantee access to food, going with the fact that food markets, when they are the way they are often appropriated by some monopolies, if you give money to people, it doesn't necessarily give them access to good quality food. So I wondered, I don't know if you could comment on this, if as basic income advocate in Canada, looking at this notion of food security, you are getting criticized a lot for this notion of food. If there are some projects going about trying to integrate more the production of the food directly, and I would love to discuss this more with you. And I'm sorry if the question is so muddled now, but just to launch you before we finish.
It's going to be maybe an equally like disjointed response, so it's fine. I think I know Elaine has done more thinking than I have on like rights-based language around food, and we've spoken about it a little bit, but like having some questions around it that are not entirely, I think, positive. And my sense partially is because a lot of the things that are like legally enshrined as rights that we're supposed, like the right to housing in Canada, which like is just simply is meaningless. Like it's meaningless at this point, really. And so she'd be a good person, because I know she's done some more thinking about that than I have. I do think, I don't know, like thinking about bigger context in Canada, like a lot of food-based organizations and like food banks and like food banking, though like a lot of food-based organizations are supportive of basic income in Canada. I think what that looks like has taken different forms. And also like we've done some work with like food justice organizations and organizations working around food sovereignty who are also pretty excited about the idea of basic income. I don't know if there have been, I haven't heard the like skepticism or critique from food folks. I do think that there's some more places to like play or think about it. Like there's been some ongoing work thinking about basic income through the lens of the fishing industry in Canada, which is like very geographically specific and like have a big part of the country, basically, or a small part of the country where people who are reliant on seasonal work and fishing, and there's been like quite a bit of work around like building and mobilizing support for basic income among those folks through the lens of like how sustainable fishing has become such a hard thing to be able to do because like of the all of these different things. Like this, it's not, that's like so not within my realm, but that to me comes to mind as the example of and like agricultural unions in Canada have been pretty favorable. Your take, please cut me off because you're going to be able to say more about that.
No, I agree. The one, your question is sort of why I've started to explore food as commons. Actually, I started my thinking as a rights-based person, right? My master's work was very much around structural violence and rights and things like that. I'm moving more towards food as commons because, as Chloe said, a lot of the right stuff is enshrined in law and is kind of meaningless in Canada, right? It's just like other places maybe, but we have a right to housing, but we got a massive housing crisis, right? And we can't seem to figure out how to deal with it. We've got, if we talked about a right to food, what does that really look like? And like I'm sort of exploring, giving people a basic income does improve their access to food. But is that really addressing their right to food when the access is to a food system that has some inherent global challenges, right? That can actually create precarity and other things like that outside of the income access. So this is why I'm starting to explore the food as commons, because I think it takes it a little bit away from this idea of it being a right, more of a community property. And I know that might seem like a subtle like a nuance to people, but to me, it's a very fundamental difference, right? If your food is produced in a community commons way and thought of that way, and I know believe me, that's a giant pitfall to get into, because there's so many issues with that, and that's why I'm very early in my exploration of it. But I feel like it's a better way to think about it than a rights-based approach, because and the other part of this is a lot of our rights-based discussions are still enshrined in a neoliberal market context, and that's what I'm trying to sort of push against, is that even basic income can be thought of as being sort of enshrined in that. And that doesn't mean it's not important. We're not, right? It doesn't mean that it's not something we should be pushing for, because currently it's what is needed to get ourselves to the next stage. But we should view it as that. We should view it as the foundation to the next thing, a transformative. Talked about this earlier in the feminist discussions, about, I think you talked about the transformative politics. That resonated with me when you mentioned that, because that's what I view basic income as being a part of, is a transformative politics versus just a technical program. And that really resonated with me. I hadn't thought about it in those terms before, but that's sort of why I'm leaning away from food as a human right, more towards food as commons.
Can I say something quickly to the discussion? Sorry.
Yes.
I mean, thank you for that. Really fascinating. And it really resonates a lot with some of the things that I have been thinking about and working on, which is moving from a rights-based language altogether to a needs-based language. And I think the language of both the sort of conversation around the commons, the conversations around caring economy, which is something that I've been working on, as well as conversations around sort of more transformative politics and basic income. I think just find better synchronicity with moving away from a rights-based language, simply because of exactly what you said, the very neoliberal atomized worldview that rights-based languages often, or rights-based frameworks often take to issues, to more needs-based languages. And the space that a needs-based framework creates for greater movement and collaboration, and more non-atomized lenses, basically, on how to view that transformation. And I think that we have the alternative is there to move away from rights. And I feel like the more we start weaving that into our regular discourse, the more powerful that can be.
Yeah, a final question. Yeah, last.
I was going to say exactly that and end up with Vibhor. Would you like to elaborate?
This is why I needed to be in the room. Thank you.
Thank you. I hope that the 3 presentations in this session have helped to deepen our understanding of this topic, the relationship between basic income and inequality and poverty, and generate new interesting questions. Thank you very much to the presenters and to everyone who participated in this session. I would like to bring session 18 to a close, and thank you.